It's time to start talking about something that sadly happens in 1 in 4 pregnancies, miscarriage.
I was ultimately diagnosed with something called a high level of natural killer cells, where your body kills off the baby as a foreign object.
I almost think of them as like they're a little mythical person that didn't exist.
At least you can get pregnant. And it's like, well, I've had 5 miscarriages now. You know, there's no consolation, really.
Why aren't we more aware of it? How do you cope if it happens to you? And what should you say, or maybe not say, to someone who's had a miscarriage? Let's talk about it.
All right, so here we are. Difficult subject today, miscarriage. Probably not that many lols. Let's just get that out of the way, first of all. But let's just talk about it. Let's just have a good old honest chat about it, I suppose. So Anniki, what's your experience of miscarriage been like?
Well, I think I sort of said that unfortunately, it feels a bit like a club where you don't want to be a member of it, really. So many women go through miscarriage, and that was one of the things that once, I've had 4 miscarriages, but once I sort of started talking to people and writing about it, I found out that there were so many women who had been through it and not really shared their experience with anyone. So it still feels like a bit of a taboo. And of course, I think people just don't really know what to say, and they don't. I think in British culture, anyway, we don't feel very comfortable talking about it. But it's just good if women can feel that they can talk about what's happened to them.
Yeah. I mean, it's happened to you as well.
I've had 5 miscarriages, so I win.
Yeah.
There we
And
are.
actually, I know this is awful, but even when I was going through the miscarriages, we did have a laugh with it. I mean, not obviously, you know, there's some obviously very upsetting moments, and I filmed it all and made it into a documentary for Discovery and TLC. But you've got to carry on living, you know, your life doesn't stop. So it's almost like you do have to have the humour. A little bit of humour gets you through it, I think, sometimes. So we can have a laugh about it, and if we need to.
Yeah. So as you say, you've both sort of talked and written about it before, but why do you think for some women they feel that it needs to be a secret?
I think it's this whole strange cult of silence that surrounds the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. I think that really doesn't help, because people don't talk about being pregnant. So how can people then sort of sympathise or empathise when you have lost a baby before 12 weeks if people don't actually know you're pregnant? And also, not to take away from the pain of miscarriage, because the pain of miscarriage is awful, both physically and emotionally. But a few years ago, well, 20, 30 years ago, before we did pregnancy tests at home, people wouldn't have known they were pregnant until they'd missed 2, maybe 3 periods. They might guess, but they wouldn't have actually known. So that was probably less of an emotional impact. We know very early on that we're pregnant. And as soon as you know you're pregnant with a wanted baby, you know, whether you lose that a day afterwards or a few weeks afterwards or 12 weeks afterwards, it's very, very upsetting if you're emotionally connected with that baby.
What do you think about the whole not telling anyone about the pregnancy till you're beyond the 12 weeks thing?
I mean, I do get a bit worried when I see so many women doing the sort of sharing the positive result on the test, the little smiley face, and I don't think I shared early on, but unfortunately you become a bit of a kind of wounded person as you go through, because if you've had more than one, you kind of learn the hard way that it's better not to tell anybody.
Do you know why the miscarriages happen? Like, did you have any information about that, or is it one of those things?
They could never really identify anything. I think what they said is, unfortunately, I'm getting on a bit, and the older you are, the more likely you are to miscarry, because your eggs are more likely to be damaged, basically. And I think miscarriage rates are really high once you hit into your 40s. And so that was probably a factor for me.
So after I had my 3rd, I sort of went headlong into research to try and find out why miscarriages happen. And I guess more importantly, could I prevent it from happening again? And I think the thing is that there's not any information out there from your GP, from your standard sources. But I found all my information on Mumsnet, somewhere I never expected to find myself, but on the forums, like speaking to other women doing what we're doing today. And I was ultimately diagnosed with something called a high level of natural killer cells, where your body kills off the baby as a foreign object, which makes total sense, really. It is a foreign object. And I think it's a very carefully balanced immune system that goes on when you actually get pregnant. And I took a lot of very hardcore drugs with a specialist to actually have my children in the end.
So what about that grieving process then? Because as you say, it's perhaps different as it would be in other circumstances. So how do you kind of manage it? How do you get through it, I suppose I'm asking?
Well, I am a big advocate of just staying in your dressing gown for about 2 weeks and not seeing people, because I think actually, certainly because of all of my mum friends were either pregnant or, you know, well on their way or had had a baby. And I knew that I wasn't strong enough. I know the American term is what triggers you. They would say, but that would be a trigger to be around those people. So I stayed at home. I watched loads of really escapist junk on telly. I love, I think it was probably Keeping Up the Kardashians and Beverly Hills Housewives. The stupider, the more inane it was, the better, because I didn't want to think. I tried not to go on forums, actually. I almost wanted to just go into brain escapist mode. And then gradually I started going out and stuff. I think one of the problems with it is that there's not a clean end to it. So it's not like you sort of get to the end and you're like, oh, that was bad, but I'm done. Like anything, it can come up at different times. And I think when anyone loses somebody, you need a period of time of thinking, how am I going to live my life without that person in my life? And if it's a miscarried child, they are a person, because basically you've projected into the future and you know what their birth date's going to be. You might have thought of some names. I almost think of them as like they're a little mythical person that didn't exist. Because as soon as you know you're pregnant, you start planning. Is it a boy? Is it a girl? What's the age difference? What school might they go to? What's their personality going to be like? What buggy am I going to get? You know, it's all that stuff that kicks in.
I did the opposite in grieving. I just went out and got drunk. That's what I did. Yeah, probably for weeks and weeks. I mean, because I hadn't been drinking. Not that I drink all the time. It's not the major thing in my life. But, you know, for 12 weeks or however, 3 months as it was, up to getting pregnant. And I was kind of missing my old life a little bit, as you do. You know, you go through all these complex feelings when you're pregnant. Am I, for the first time, I'm going to become a mum. This is going to take away from my lifestyle in some way. So I had those positive and negative feelings about the pregnancies. And after I miscarried, which was at 12 weeks, which was a very, very painful, physical, horrible experience. I had contractions, proper contractions and everything. And people don't talk about that. I just needed to get drunk, to listen to music, to go out and see bands and to try and capture that life that I thought I was leaving behind. But I was incredibly miserable when doing it as well. It didn't really help, but you just do what you've got to do to get through.
I think that's it. I mean, I would imagine that you're going to be miserable almost whatever you do, so you might as well do the least uncomfortable thing, whatever that is. I mean, dressing gown or drinking, or perhaps drinking your dressing gown. Why not bring them together?
When you're out in a pub.
Yeah, I did go back to work, and at the time I worked in this really hardcore corporate environment, and I was a managing partner, so we were having a board meeting with 3 blokes and me, and I thought I was okay. And I just started crying because one of them said, "I'm sorry, I heard what happened." And I started crying, and I realised actually that I couldn't be back in work. I had to get back into the dressing gown. And so I did. I literally said, "I'm sorry," and I left, and I spent another week at home in my dressing gown.
It's nice that they were understanding though, because I've had reports of people not telling their work, and then they go and have the operation. If you don't sort of miscarry on the loo or it doesn't come out naturally, you have to have the operation, and then you go back to work. Like they've had some dental treatment. I can't imagine what it'd be like to be sitting at your desk after you've just got rid of your dead baby essentially, and having to speak to people and pretend everything's normal.
And actually everyone's different. Like some people might feel much better, straight back to work, pretend it never happened, move on, and that might work for them. And I suppose that's the thing, is that it's horses for courses, but just the challenge is it will come and bite you in the butt one day. Like you will be listening to Radiohead on the tube, or you'll see a pregnant woman, or you will have a little think about the date that it is and how that relates to this child.
Is the due date quite hard?
Yeah, very, I think, yeah. Like you said, you plan, you know that the baby would be 6 months on your birthday. You plan, oh, it's going to be amazing, I'm going to have a new baby at Christmas. All these things that remind you, it's not just the actual due date, it's all those things that you've planned that are then sort of taken away from you.
We've talked a bit about this, but not what should people say, but sometimes it's difficult to know what to say. So I haven't had a miscarriage, and obviously I know people who have because it's so common, and I sometimes struggle with, what is the best way to be sympathetic? How do I show that I'm thinking of them without being patronising or upsetting, or, what do we say?
So I would just say, is there anything I can do? Is there any way I can help? And try and avoid, I call it competitive kind of grief mongering, where you get people going, I don't know, well, my friends had 17 miscarriages. I mean, we joked about it at the beginning, or, this has happened to my other friend, or don't try and compare, just acknowledge that it's rubbish and do you need any help, and that's it. And
it's no more or less rubbish whether you've got a child already or whether it's your fourth or your first.
And try not to back it up with, I think that's the problem, that little qualifier where you go, at least it's not la la la. Because for that person in that situation, it does feel, and I've come to understand that whatever's happened to you, we're all little islands, and whatever happens to you, it's the worst possible thing for you. And that's the thing. So you telling me that, it could have been even worse doesn't make me feel any better. So I think
it's very subjective, isn't it? People will react in different ways, and people say the most ridiculous, horrible things that sound ridiculous and horrible to us. But
what's the worst thing anyone said to you?
Oh, I can't remember really. Just like, you can try again. At least it wasn't a real baby. At least you can get pregnant. And it's like, well, I've had 5 miscarriages now. There's no consolation really. But there's some truth in it as well. People that do have infertility and miscarriage are far less likely. The more times you've got pregnant, the more likely you're going to have of one sticking. So people say stupid things, and I think it's just that they have a sense of awkwardness and they don't really know what to say.
You can blame yourself for what has happened, and I think I found myself really it had implications for the way I felt about my body, because I kind of felt that it was normal and natural to have a pregnancy to full term, and it wasn't to have a miscarriage. It was abnormal, and it was somehow down to something I'd done. And because I was in a stressful job at the time, I kind of felt like maybe that was my fault, and I think all of that blame can be internalised. And so a big message for women when they're going through it is to think it's not my fault, it's not something that I've done, because actually then you've got another layer, you've got the grief, and then you've also got the kind of the guilt, because you're kind of like, was it the fact that I had a coffee, I had an argument with a colleague, I was really stressed out, I didn't get a seat on the tube. It's all of those things, and hopefully discussions like this make people realise that it isn't. Unfortunately, it's just a terrible, terrible thing that happens. And sometimes there is a medical reason, but it's not your fault that it's happened.
I think that guilt is very, very common and totally misplaced, because there's nothing that you can do. Having researched this intensely, there's nothing really that you can do to cause a miscarriage in that way.
What about your partners then? This must affect your relationship, presumably.
He was feeling it too, but I feel a lot of time the partner gets neglected because it is about us. I'm sorry, mostly it is about us because we're the ones that are going through it physically, and the hormones raging and your body changing and everything like that. But, they still go through it as well. They still go through that emotional aspect of it, if not the physical.
There probably are, hopefully, forums that men can go to, because I think they kind of need to, because I sort of felt like he was in the caretaker role, and so he was just looking after me. And I was pretty crazy. I was crying at the drop of a hat. I would cry into my dinner. I would shout and scream at him. It was a real like this. Kind of, it was unpredictable. And he needed probably some support.
Did you have your miscarriages before your daughter or after, or a bit of both?
Well, a bit of both,
And did you find a difference between how you felt about the ones before you became a mum to after?
Before was definitely, it's difficult to quantify, but it was definitely worse. I think I did become more jaded as it went along, and so I held back. So even though I knew I was pregnant, last year I was pregnant, and I knew that even if you have had a child, I think you do have a bit of a sense. I hate it when people say, well, at least you've got one.
But it is true to a certain extent.
It is kind of true, I think, because I think
you've crossed that line between never knowing if you're ever going to become a mum and having become a mum. So you have luckily crossed that line.
And the other thing that happens is that you've got to go into parenting mode, and that helps, because the bad experience I had where I was just watching reality TV and screaming and in a bad sort of film, that couldn't happen because I had a daughter at home who I couldn't really do the dressing gown thing. I still had to go and take her to things and pick her up, and that helped in a way, actually.
So we asked the internet for any tips on dealing with miscarriage. Here's one the internet came up with: stop to acknowledge the passing of your child. That feels important.
Yes, I think that feels important for us, and that's probably something we'd like from our friends as well. We don't want too much sympathy, but we don't want to just sort of brush it off either,
If you can, tell people what's happening.
I chose 1 or 2 really close friends, and that was it, and that was fine. That was good enough for me.
I told the world. I was on Loose Women, I was on Women's Hour, I was on every single national paper. But I also told my friends and, random passing waiters. I think it's, like you said, it's very personal. And just do what helps you. If it makes you feel better about yourself, you're going through an awful thing, anything that makes you feel better, as long as it's not at the expense of other people's happiness, do it.
I think this ties into so many things. It's the same with pregnancy and births, and every woman is different, every family is different, and so it is quite hard to give one size fits all advice, isn't it? But let's press on. The internet says try not to let distance grow between you and your partner. Was that an issue for you?
I think probably it is good advice, but it's just difficult in how you would do that. Maybe, you know what it is? It's probably things like having a cuddle and sort of saying thank you if they're kind of looking after you, rather than just screaming at them and being a nightmare.
So thank you very much for sharing your stories with us. Thank you ever so much for watching. Do please leave a comment if you want to talk about your experience of miscarriage. We think it's good to talk about it. I think we've all agreed on that today. So yes, until next time, bye-bye.
What?